Hi guys, in this session we're going to be looking at on-country learning, and we're also going to be finding out more about belonging to country and its significance for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. As a part of this, we're going to be examining the concept of terra nullius, as this was the beginning point of the disruption to connection to country for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We're going to be asking the question, what is country? And we're also going to be exploring the idea of on-country learning as an Indigenous pedagogical process. I also need to note that there are images of deceased people in this presentation. So I like to begin this presentation with a meme. It sort of represents my well and truly Mr. Youth, and something that I think engages a lot of the younger generations. So this is a three-panel meme. At the top panel, we've got an ISIS language map of the entire Australian continent, and each colour represents a specific group or language, which shows just how multicultural and diverse Australia has always been. And of course, the figure in the other two panels is a guy called Captain Cook. And if you're not sure who he is, he allegedly discovered Australia. And of course, that is the crux of the humour, which I hope this gives you a bit of a chuckle. Because he certainly wasn't the first person to discover it, because it had been well and truly discovered by the thousands of generations that had already been born and grown up on this continent. The reason why we begin with terra nullius, despite the fact that it's a very recent designation in Australia, is simply because for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, this is the beginning of the end. When the Europeans arrive in Australia, when Captain Cook arrives, he basically makes a decision at the time, even though he met Aboriginal people from around Botany Bay where he landed, but he makes this designation, says essentially because he can't see anything that he determines is human habitation, therefore there must not be sovereign power over the country, and therefore they can declare it terra nullius and then seize it for the British Crown. Now, terra nullius is an obscure Roman legal definition which translates as nobody's land, and essentially can only be exercised over land which has never been subject to a sovereign power, or land where the sovereign power has explicitly stated that they don't want it anymore. Now, of course, this buys into the idea of the Great Australian Silence, which is a term by W.H. Stanner from 1968, where essentially through the declaration of terra nullius, Australia becomes a European colony, and it essentially erases all of the people, the histories, the cultures, and the sustainable land management practices that had been in this country for tens of thousands of years prior. Now, of course, the specific reasoning for terra nullius being declared was based on how the land was or was not being used. And the two determinants were alienation, that is, land which is available to be accessed by some specific people and excluded from other specific people, and also land usage. So Captain Cook was looking for houses, gardens, farms, mines, all these sorts of things, which for his Eurocentric ideas of what they should look like would have been quite stark on the landscape. But what we know is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land management practices were so sophisticated that they were essentially built into the shape of the landscape. And for those coming from outside, depending on where you were, could have been challenging to see. The legal definition of terra nullius, of which Australia was considered, only lasted around about 200 or so years, give or take a few years. And essentially this was because it was far easier for the Crown, for the British Crown, to come in and take the land if they didn't have to recognise the sovereignty of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who were already here. And Australia is the only place in the world where the colonisers have come in and have not actually made a treaty, because to make a treaty indicates there's a recognition of sovereignty of both parties. Now, what this meant was that Australia was terra nullius until the 1990s. So this was essentially a situation where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land rights and native title didn't exist, unless, of course, it was through the largesse of the colonisers who would, like we saw in the 1960s with the Gurindji people and the Vesties Station, would hand the land back or not. And so, but there were several legal challenges because many Aboriginal communities and individuals knew that they had connections to country and wanted to see that legally recognised. Now, of course, in 1971, we have the case of Mirilpim versus Nabelco, and this went as far as the Northern Territory Supreme Court, and this is known as the Blackburn decision. Now, Justice Richard Blackburn ruled in favour of Nabelco and justified his ruling, claiming that there was no Aboriginal title, and recognised that the law in the time of the British colonies was only British, and that there was a distinction between the colonies and other areas being desert and uncultivated. Furthermore, he argued that in the desert and uncultivated areas there lived uncivilized inhabitants in a primitive state of society. So even into the 1970s, we're seeing very powerful people within the Australian community, justices, judges, politicians, all those sorts of things, really saying some pretty super duper racist things. But he was also hedging his bets because he also said that the Crown had the power to extinguish native title if it had ever existed in the first place. And this is an important distinction because it has ramifications moving forward. Fast forward almost 20 years to 1992, and this is known as the Mabo decision. So this was a landmark case in Australia. It spent 10 years in the High Court, which is the most senior court in the country, which is specifically designed for questions around constitutional law. Now, of course, the Constitution being established on the premise of terra nullius. Now, what this was a group of people, the most notable being Eddie Mabo, who launched a legal challenge against the concept and the designation of Australia's terra nullius. Now, Mabo was from Muir, which is also known as Murray Island in the Torres Strait. He lived and worked for much of his life in Townsville and also other parts of Queensland. Now, it's interesting that during his time on the mainland, he worked as a gardener at James Cook University, and he spoke of his home as an island, as one who owned it. Now, of course, there is an anecdote from this time, I don't know how true it is, where when he was informed that in fact his island wasn't owned by him, it was in fact owned by the Crown, he got visibly distressed. Now, of course, a couple of budding lawyers heard his story and heard what he had to say and thought that this actually would be a really important thing to follow up through the courts. And especially after in 1981 when he delivered a paper at a land rights conference where he explained the land inheritance process on Muir Island. Now, of course, what this meant was if there was a formalised land inheritance process, what this meant was that there was a sovereign power with laws and traditions and requirements that this island was subject to. And so the idea of terra nullius then could be challenged on the basis that it wasn't actually an empty land. Now, of course, 10 years later, after an epic battle, the ruling was handed down which struck out the legal definition of terra nullius and paved the way for formal recognition of native title. Now, tragically, this ruling was made 6 months after the death of Eddie Mabo, and unfortunately he never saw the results of this hard and incredibly long fight. So I've given you a bit of a very brief chronological breakdown of the rise and fall of terra nullius in Australia. Now, what this means is we're left with a really complicated legal apparatus around how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can access country. Now, this means we have several different layers of land ownership. So at the most highest level of land ownership is a freehold lease. So that is land which is subject to a freehold lease. So that is homes, businesses, public places, anything that's owned in private hands is subject to a freehold lease. And the law basically says that if it's got a freehold lease, any native title has been extinguished. It cannot be established. Then you've got pastoral leases and you've got mining leases. Now, this is where it becomes a little bit more complex because these two types of land is land which is ostensibly owned by the government but leased to agriculture and to miners. And so they pay the government royalties and then they run cattle or grow crops or dig it up. Now, the Wick decision a few years after the Mabo decision meant that in that case, native title is not necessarily extinguished And it is possible then to have a pastoral lease and native title over the same piece of land. So that means that we have to start negotiating co-usage agreements with those lands. And then, of course, the lowest type of land tenure is native title, and that can be extinguished relatively easy. But the thing to consider is the concept of land ownership as a commodity is something which comes to Australia with non-Indigenous people. So many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, especially in traditional contexts, but also in contemporary contexts, we know that country is not a commodity or something to be exploited. We know that country is not something to be owned by individuals, and we know that country is not something to be used to stratify society. Now, what I mean by that is what we see in other older Bronze Age, ancient cultures. The individuals who control access to land are the ones that tend to be on top of the power pyramid. This is, and then everybody sort of sits below them in a whole lot of different layers. Now, this is not how country is conceptualized in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander understandings. Country to us is us. It is our food. It is our medicine. It is our classroom. It is our law, which teaches us how to live. And it is our law, LAW, which teaches us right from wrong. Country is our responsibility. Country is our stories, our language. It's our community, our dances, our songs. Country is our ceremony. It's our culture, our sacred places, our ancestors. And country is our past and our future. Within country, we lie, and within us lies country. And so for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we cannot separate these two things. And this is what gets to the heart of this particular session when we consider this in the context of belonging. As country belongs to us, we belong to country. And so this is where, for many non-Indigenous people, there's often a bit of a cognitive disconnect because many other communities don't have the same sort of relationship with where they live. And this goes far, far deeper than getting back to nature or experiencing the exotic or anything like that. And as you experience the Scar Tree Walk as part of this session, what I want you to really do is to consider how country belongs to you and how you belong to country, and think about how that might influence how you choose to live and the decisions that you choose to make. In building on the previous slide, this means that as Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people, we are both owners of and owned by country. This is where our spirits and our ancestors reside, and where they inform us, as I said before, through law and law, as to what we should be doing. Country is healing, it is learning, and it is growing. We are the custodians of country, and we ask that you treat country with respect. And the thing to consider at the heart of our custodian of country is sustainability. And that only comes from a significantly complex understanding of country and the science of land management, and a deep, deep respect for country. And so this is the kind of values and knowledge that we want to instill in our young people as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, but also in the wider Australian community as well, because this is our shared home and we need to look after it. Now, I mentioned in the previous slide that we're going to be going on a Scar Tree Walk as part of this session, and that is most certainly going to be happening. And so what we're actually going to be doing is we're going to be modelling what on-country learning as an Indigenous pedagogical approach could look like, and does look like in many cases, in many different educational contexts around the country. What we're also considering is how we belong to country and how country belongs to us, and how this impacts on the concept of belonging. So for many of you, you will be comfortable with the idea of belonging to yourselves. You'll be comfortable with the idea of belonging to others, to your friends, to your family, to community. And so this is where we start to expand our ideas of what belonging means by considering how we belong in other contexts. And like I mentioned earlier, this idea of belonging to country is something that many non-Indigenous communities don't necessarily have. Now, what we know is that on-country learning is where knowledge of country and also knowledge of a wide range of different contexts is transmitted via elders, culture men, and culture women. Traditionally, it's transmitted through story, song, dance, and ceremony in the more formal contexts, but this is in addition to the everyday learning on country where young people learn the skills and stories to assist us to thrive in some very harsh environments. And of course, also the holistic ideas of how we live in a community. As I mentioned earlier, this goes beyond getting back to nature and is indicative of a far more in-depth connection to country. Now, by its very nature, it's experiential and it helps children to learn through the affective domain as well through talking and writing. Now, of course, in early childhood context, the writing is not necessarily going to be there yet, but certainly as part of play-based pedagogy, there is an expectation that children will be learning through doing, and on-country learning is a really wonderful opportunity for them to do that. Now, something that it's also important to consider is that on-country learning fits beautifully within the 8 ways Indigenous pedagogy, which I will be linking through on this Canvas page as well. At this point, I do need to note that for our online students, because of your geographical dislocation, we won't actually be able to see you in the flesh for the on-country walk, but what we've got for you guys is one that we've recorded previously where you'll follow Uncle Mick and a small group of students around that Scar Tree walk. And so as you are experiencing that as a recording, what I think would be beneficial for you is to consider how that might play out in a physical sense, and as well as that, also considering what I mentioned previously around the idea of belonging and that sort of dimension of belonging to country. Now, of course, as early childhood teachers, what you need to consider is how you might incorporate this sort of content in your play-based pedagogy and the learning activities that you plan. Now, of course, one of the very typical go-tos is doing Indigenous art. Now, the challenge around that is that when we think about Indigenous art, we automatically go specifically to dot painting, but that dot painting is specific to a particular region in the central deserts of Australia and is not indicative of Indigenous art overall. So I would always advise a little bit of caution when you're going to do that. Do a comparative, or if possible, make sure that the art matches the country where your learning centre is located, and that will never steer you wrong. Some early learning centres are starting to do more outdoor activities around gardens, and so the consideration of like a bush tucker or a medicine garden might be something you might want to get involved with. I know many early childhood centres are building relationships with local elders and community organisations, and bringing them in as regularly and often as possible is always a wonderful thing and will never ever be a negative thing. Things to consider. I know that often in early childhood you're limited in opportunities for excursions, that sort of thing. But as you go through primary school, there are opportunities to visit national parks and other areas. And there may very well be a local area you could visit as in an early childhood centre. And they're often administered by traditional owners. So it's a good opportunity to engage with them. And that could also be as part of your own professional development. And on that point, Bunjalaka at the Melbourne Museum as part of your professional development, as well as the Koori Heritage Trust, which is located in Federation Square. The Koori Heritage Trust, they run some great walks as well, so you could consider that if you're around that area in Melbourne. And Bunjalaka is a must-see at the Melbourne Museum. It's on permanent exhibition and it's just wonderful. And of course, depending on the context of where you end up working as an educator, there will often be local community and cultural centres, and I think they're really good to get involved with and to visit as part of your professional development and engagement with the local community. So when we consider the idea of on-country learning, and this is very relevant for the context that you are going to engage with it as part of this subject, as well as if this is something that you engage with as your professional careers as early childhood educators, when engaging with on-country learning, context is key. Don't let this experience for your students or your children be tokenistic. Now, you've also got to, and this is also goes for yourself as well when you're engaging with this as part of this subject. And you've also got to identify that it's not about experiencing exotic cultures for the sake of difference, which often is the case when we start looking at different cultural ways of being, living, doing, and knowing. But this is about an authentic cultural experience, one which challenges Western ontologies especially, but also many non-Indigenous ontological outlooks as well. And it's also a really good way of contrasting Western ways of teaching and learning. Now, what we aim to do through this experience, through you guys and your children and learners as well, is build on the cultural competency there, so that in many, many years' time, when I have students who will come into my courses, I'll say, let's go do a scar tree walk, and you know, we go out and do it, and I'll have students who will come to me and say, this is like the 10th one I've been on, these are great. Because often, for many of my students, this is a first. And so I look forward to the future where this is going to be far more commonplace. Now, of course, what we know is that the cultural competency of the children and the educators in that learning space leads to greater levels of cultural safety for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander learners in the early childhood centres. And of course, by extension, as we teach the children, as they become adults, they will hopefully maintain those views. And so this will create a far more broad cultural safety context across the society and community as well. What we know is on-country learning and belonging to country allows for better outcomes for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous learners. And what we know as educators is that humanity is at the center and at the heart of good teaching practice, because we're sure as hell not in it for the money. And what this means is, as we engage with the ontological perspectives of other ethnicities and cultures and groups of people, we're better able to integrate them within our own. And as we start to look at all of those different cultural lenses and we start to gather them and collect them, what that essentially means is that individuals, we can become far closer to humanity because we have far more of humanity that is embedded within us. And so these are the sorts of things that you should never ever underestimate as part of this process. In this session, we've covered Terra Nullius, the rise and the fall of Terra Nullius. We've looked at what is country. We've looked at on-country learning. And I think the really wonderful experience that we're going to have as part of this session is to actually get involved and start doing some on-country learning of our own. And I can't wait to see you. Cheers.